Tiny die.
Tonight on Politics Unplugged, the Arizona legislative session is now over. We're breaking down the highlights just ahead.
I think we're going to get it passed, and it's going to mean a lot overall to the quality of your roads and maintenance of your bridges and tunnels. It's a big deal.
Plus, Congress is working to pass an infrastructure deal. Here our one-on-one interview with White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki on what this means for Arizona.
I think everyone is ready for some common sense when it comes to democracy, making sure that everyone has an opportunity to participate in elections, and I've led the charge on that fight.
And meet the state representative hoping to take on one of the most important positions in the state. Politics Unplugged starts right now. And good evening. I'm political editor Dennis Welch, and this is Politics Unplugged. And next year's Secretary of State's race is one to watch, and we've already seen several candidates express interest in that competition. On the Republican side, it's State Representatives Shauna Bullock and Mark Fincham, along with State Senator Michelle Ugenti-Rita, and Boldin, the executive of a local marketing firm. And on the Democratic side, it's former Mayor Maricopa County Recorder Adrian Fontes and House Minority Leader Reginald Boldin. And tonight, we're talking to Mr. Boldin about his campaign. And thank you very much for joining us, taking some time out to talk about that campaign. First off, first question, why are you taking this step? Why the Secretary of State's office?
First, thank you for having me, Dennis. The stakes couldn't be more clear right now. What we're seeing across this state and across this country is an attack on our democracy. And it demands that someone has the leadership, the know-how, and the skills to actually fight for the values of freedom for our country and for our state. I lead one of the largest nonprofit organizations that actually is involved in civic engagement, and spending the last 7 years at the state legislature on the front lines fighting for voting rights. I've shown what we can do when we work together, and I'm excited to take that to the Secretary of State's office.
Now, I'm sure you've got, a whole host of ideas and things you want to accomplish if you're elected for this position, but give me your top priority. What's the one thing you think that needs to be accomplished in the next 4 years regarding elections in this state and with the Secretary of State's office?
One thing that's extremely important for people to know is that the Secretary of State's office, they have to make sure that they can work with the legislature in order to enact election laws. Quite frankly, you need to have someone who understands that process. And for me, I'll be fighting for ways that we get laws in place that allow for more access to the ballot. We must have safe, secure elections. Anyone who's legally eligible to vote, they should have the ability to do that, absent of any barriers. So for me, making sure that we're protecting our freedom to vote by providing access, also making sure that we're pushing back against any of these suppression tactics that we've seen over the weeks and months since we've seen the 2020 outcomes.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about that. I mean, currently you're in the House of Representatives. They also say that some of the moves they've made this year with their election laws is all about safe and secure election. I want to get your take on what you saw out of the state legislature this year in regards to new election laws passed.
In 2018 and in 2020, elected leaders, community leaders, they told people to go out and vote, and they did. And when they did that, they changed the dynamics of Arizona, of our politicians, and of what was possible here in this state. And because of that, what we saw was voter suppression bills to make it less likely for people to vote. It's nothing safe and secure about removing 200,000 people from the permanent early voting list, or it's nothing safe and secure about implementing laws or trying to implement laws that would require people to photocopy their state ID in order to put it in their ballot to mail. So we know that there's areas that we can talk about safety and security, but what we've seen at the legislature was pure suppression.
And do you think some of these laws, particularly the two you just mentioned that were passed this year, can this be challenged in court? Or are you going to be involved in leading any of those challenges?
Last year, Arizona Coalition for Change, a group that I founded here, a statewide organization working with civic engagement, we challenge and back the Secretary of State's office to ensure that more people have the ability to register to vote, to participate in the 2020 election. And I can tell you right now, when we look at bills like Senate Bill 1485 and others that directly impact individuals' rights to vote, myself, the groups that I work with, we are looking at all options. All options are on the table because we have to protect the freedom for people to vote here in Arizona.
Now, in one law that won't be able to be challenged because it just got ruled on by the High Court here in the United States Supreme Court. This is the bill that deals with ballot harvesting. It basically limits only like immediate family members. Say that you can take your early ballot and take it to the polling location. I want to get your thought on that ruling and how it affects voting here in Arizona.
It's disheartening. The reality is we should be enforcing voting rights laws, not weakening them. And essentially what we saw the Supreme Court do was essentially look to weaken our voting rights laws and create a mechanism that will open up for a number of different challenges to make it harder for people to vote. The reality is people who looked like me, literally they had their life taken from them for the simple fact of trying to vote. They were put through Jim Crow type laws and legislation, so they couldn't have their voices heard. In 2021, we cannot live in a state or in a country that will continue these same practices. And that's why I'm running for Secretary of State. As I mentioned, the stakes are too high, and we have to make sure that we're fighting from the legislature to the Secretary of State's office to the Supreme Court to make sure that people have the right to vote.
That ruling also said upheld a position that voters can only cast ballots in the precincts they were assigned. So that raises the question. I mean, do you favor something like these voting centers that Adrian Fontes, who is your likely opponent in this Democratic primary, set up in Maricopa County last year? Is this something that you favor?
You know, the reality is anyone who's eligible to vote, we should not put hurdles in place. So if it's simply that someone is going to vote in a voting center that is 2 miles down the street as opposed to 2 blocks down the street, and for a system to say that they're ineligible to do that, I don't think that's the way that we should be running elections here in Arizona. We should make sure that people who can vote, that we're decreasing barriers. So if that means allowing folks to vote outside of their precincts, that's a real conversation that Arizona should talk about. Look, Arizona has always led the way when it comes to voting rights. We were first in the nation to lead mail-in ballots, and we've been innovative. But we have to make sure that we are protecting the ballot box, protecting the voters to make sure that they have access.
And final question, just because we had Mr. Fontes on the show a few weeks ago, we asked him, why should voters pick him and not you? I'll ask you the same question. What makes you a better Secretary of State candidate than your opponent right now, Mr. Fontes?
You know, the current reality is the Secretary of State's office is not only the chief election officer, it's also the lieutenant governor here in the state of Arizona, which means that in the event that something happens to the governor, you need someone that can step in immediately. You know, over the last 7 years, I spent leading the state legislature, 4 in leadership, and currently as the minority leader. I voted on 7 state budgets and have passed a number of different bills into law. I've done it. And with regards to fighting for voting rights and providing access, I've done it. I lead one of the largest civic engagement voter registration organizations in the state. And quite frankly, our voters, they need someone who they can trust. They need someone with integrity, and they need someone who's willing to make the hard calls. And I've been able to do that, and I've shown I've done that, not just with my words, but with my actions. So, I'm ready.
All right. Thank you very much. That's Reginald Boldin, Democratic candidate for the Secretary of State here in Arizona. And turning our attention now to the Capitol Hill, where Congress is hard at work trying to pass an infrastructure deal. Now, last month, the White House reached a bipartisan infrastructure agreement with moderate lawmakers. The $1 trillion proposal focuses on solid infrastructure such as roads, bridges, and public transit. Now, the hope is Congress can pass the agreement sometime this month. We sat down for a one-on-one interview with White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki to discuss the infrastructure deal. Okay, so infrastructure, it's what everybody wants to talk about these days. We know that there's now this bipartisan deal. We know that Kyrsten Sinema was intimately involved in brokering this deal. And can you tell me about how important her involvement is with this right now?
Yeah, she was hugely involved in this deal, played an incredible leadership role in bringing Democrats and Republicans together to find areas of agreement. And that's something that our muscles are a little atrophied on here in Washington, but she played a really important role bringing people together, talking about how they can find common ground, figuring out how we can agree to money to rebuild roads and railways and bridges, but also to expand broadband access, make sure kids have access to clean drinking water. And what resulted in is a $1.2 trillion deal. The president, Democrats and Republicans standing outside the White House together talking about that. That's something we haven't seen in a while.
And so specifically, what does this mean for people in Arizona here? What's on the line for them? How could this help just everyday Arizonans?
You know, this is going to have an impact on probably every person living in this country and in Arizona, because if you are just driving your kids to school, you're driving to work, almost everybody recognizes when there are too many potholes, roads that aren't working, bridges that have lanes that are shut down, that are slowing down your commute. This will help rebuild a lot of those basic infrastructure that people rely on. It will also invest in public transit, which is something a lot of people in Arizona rely on, especially in cities, to get to work. We need to expand that. We need to expand in electric vehicles and ways that we can also help our climate in the process. But also making sure that people in Arizona have access to broadband access or high-speed internet so that they can work from home, do remote schooling from home if that's ever needed again. We really saw that discrepancy over the last year. That's a key component. And also replacing lead pipes to make sure kids have access to clean drinking water, something that's long overdue and will also help put people back to work.
And we've seen that I saw some recent polling, I believe it was 6 in 10 Americans support this infrastructure plan, but this bipartisan deal isn't sitting completely well with all the progressives in the Democratic Party, the president's own party. Do you expect that to be any problem? How do you overcome that?
Well, part of what the president's focused on is talking about telling the story of how this package will benefit people across the country and all the components in it that should be exciting to members of the Democratic Party. So he was out in Wisconsin. He's going to be out traveling and doing more of that. He had an opinion piece out in Yahoo News earlier this week. What we've been telling members of our party is that this is a down payment. There's also a reconciliation package, a budget package that we're going to work through with Democrats in Congress to get additional priority items passed into law, including an investment in universal pre-K, community college, and additional climate priorities to the president and many members of the Democratic Party.
Can you pair this with what's being called the soft infrastructure plan, like the anti-poverty programs and some of the more progressives in the party? Can you do that? Are you guys going through reconciliation? Do you have to think again about blowing up the filibuster?
No, absolutely, we can do that. Human infrastructure, as we call it, which means extension of the child tax credit, universal pre-K, funding for community college, paid leave. That is all a part of what's being considered in the budget reconciliation process. And that requires just the majority of votes. So Democrats to stand together and support a final package going through. I will also note, though, it will be paid for. That's part of the process and the president continues to believe that making adjustments to the corporate rate, going back to what it was during the first year of the Bush administration, and asking the highest income earners, the top 1%, to pay a little more can help pay for these initiatives.
All right. Thank you very much. And the Supreme Court upheld a pair of Arizona election laws that critics said will make it harder for minorities to vote. The 6-3 ruling said that the two laws do not violate the 1965 Voting Rights Act. And one of those laws the High Court upheld requires voters to cast their ballots only at their assigned precincts or have those votes tossed. Now, the other bans anyone other than basically immediate family members from collecting early ballots for someone and delivering those to the poll. And one Native American state lawmaker we spoke with said that the ban on so-called ballot harvesting targets people on tribal lands.
And this will criminalize our neighbors, our good Samaritans, our people.
In sparsely populated areas like the Navajo Nation, where she lives, State Senator Jamesita Peshlikai said many voters who may not have access to reliable transportation depend on their neighbors to help deliver their ballots to polling stations that may be many miles away. The Democratic lawmaker also lashed out at Attorney General Mark Brnovich, who pushed the case to the Supreme Court. Peshlikai said Brnovich, a Republican, is trying to suppress votes in areas that lean Democratic in statewide and presidential elections.
They are being retaliated against by the Attorney General.
In an interview on Good Morning Arizona, Brnovich said ballot harvesting opens up greater risks of voter fraud.
The reality is that one of the greatest threats to election integrity is having political candidates or political parties collect and handle your ballot.
Even though there is no evidence of widespread voter fraud in the 2020 election, Brnovich, who is now running for the U.S. Senate, said election integrity was his only motivation for pursuing the case.
This case was always about the rule of law. It was about what can we do to make sure that everyone who has the right to vote votes, and at the same time protect the integrity of the process.
And there is also some concern that this ruling could have an effect and make it harder to challenge election laws in the future.
So ordered. We are officially sine die. Adjourned.
And the Arizona legislative session has wrapped up. It was one of the longest sessions in modern state history. One of the last items on the agenda was passing that budget, which included a permanent tax cut, mostly benefiting the rich. Governor Ducey signed that tax cut and the rest of the nearly $13 billion budget into law this week. And with me to break down the legislative session is Howie Fisher, journalist for Capitol Media Services, and Dylan Rosenblatt, the legislative reporter for the Arizona Capitol Times. Thank you both for joining us. And Howie, I just want to start with you. You know, this is how many sessions that you have covered. Put this one in perspective for us. I mean, what were the broad general themes of what happened down there at the Capitol?
Well, thank you for pointing out that this is my 39th legislative session. I don't even want to know how old some of our viewers are. This one was particularly contentious for a couple of reasons. Number one, last year's session had to be truncated because of the virus, so there was a lot of pent-up demand. You also had the fact that we have a 16 margin in the Senate for Republicans out of 30 and 31 out of 60 in the House, which basically made everybody king or queen for a day. They got to have veto power. So there were a lot of folks who wanted something, who were holding out for something, and got to do a little bit of wheeling and dealing in this thing, and that's how we got out of here. But it was a particularly ugly session in some ways. A lot of freshmen thought that they were in charge. People like Jake Hoffman sought to do things like kill the Senate president's plan for hiking unemployment insurance, and it's never good to screw with the Senate president.
And Dylan, I want to ask you kind of the same question too. What sticks out to you? What's the big themes that you were noticing as this record-long session drug out all the way until nearly July?
Well, kind of like Howie said, I mean, with the slim margins in both the House and the Senate, they're not just one-vote majorities for the Republicans, but each party has gotten more polarized since the 2019-2020 legislative sessions. You have a lot more conservative Republicans now, so not only is there a one-vote majority, but they're less likely to work with the opposite party. Losing Heather Carter and Kate Grove-McGee in the Senate was a big part of them being able to get as much of a conservative priority list done this entire session. And I mean, as every headline in Arizona and nationally has shown over the past several months, the biggest thing this entire session was clouded by the Senate's audit, which affected a lot of the stuff that happened this year. And that was clearly one of the biggest themes between the audit and obviously Ducey's tax cut.
And Howie, let me ask you, we've been talking a lot about some new election laws here. What's the ones that stick out to you that are going to have the biggest impact overall for voters once they head back to the polls next year?
Well, some of the more radical ones were defeated. For example, Shauna Bullock had a proposal to say, even if the vote tally turns out a certain way, the legislature gets to decide who gets the electors. Now, remember, this is the woman who wants to head elections as Secretary of State. The most sweeping one in some ways deals with the issue of what they call or have called the permanent early voting list. And theoretically, once you sign up, you keep getting an early ballot until you say you don't want it anymore. The new law says that if you don't use that early ballot for 4 successive elections, i.e. primary, general, you don't get it anymore. Now, you can get back on the list, but there are a lot of folks who are saying, now, wait a second. Some people are only interested when there's a high-profile issue, like the 2020 election with a record turnout and something like 88% of people using an early ballot. Why should the folks who decide they didn't particularly want to vote in 2016 and 2018 have lost that? And there's various figures about how many 100,000 people would not get the early ballots. Obviously, the folks on the Republican side say we're just cleaning up the whole issue of what the rolls look like, what the early ballots look like. And as you pointed out in the last segment, now with the Supreme Court ruling that states have very liberal authority to do things that they believe are related to election integrity, that's going to make it real hard to challenge this one.
And Dylan, I want to tell you, speaking of some of the things of voters, last November, voters narrowly passed Proposition 208. This was supposed to raise nearly $1 billion. It was supposed to go to K-12 schools. Now, there were a couple of measures that were passed late in this session that is going to, you're going to see less revenues than were expected for K-12 education. Can you explain what those measures are and what the effect is?
So there's one where part of the budget that the governor already signed this past week would kind of be in a roundabout way of cutting some of the money. I mean, the highest taxpayers got a 3.5% surcharge from Proposition 208. So that money is still going to go to teachers, but those taxpayers are getting 3.5% of their taxes cut from the general fund. So that's part one. Part two is a bill from Senator J.D. Mesnard that kind of sets up, it prevents small businesses from being able to be affected by Proposition 208, which kind of renews the entire argument from both of those campaigns back in November of nobody from small businesses or no small businesses will have to pay any additional taxes, says the pro side, and the anti-208 side says, well, they will have to, and this is just kind of setting up a way for them to be completely exempt from it. And it's likely going to cut about a third of the expected revenue that Prop 208 is supposed to bring.
All right. And Howie, we've got a couple minutes left, and I do want to get into this because, you are, a great resource in Arizona. You've covered the legislature for so long. I would like to get your take on a bill that maybe was lost in the shuffle here with all the focus on these tax cuts, these election laws. Can you give us a bill or two that you think a new law that was passed is going to have a big effect on Arizonans that maybe got lost, again, like I said, in the shuffle with everything else?
I think that what we're going to find is somewhere buried in the budget bills, there are these little provisions which have nothing to do with money, which all of a sudden we're going to find out we changed the policy, whether it has to do with who needs to wear a mask, who can ask about somebody's virus status, issues about what can occur in the classroom. For example, the question of so-called critical race theory, which this really isn't, but it says that you can't tell, let's say, a white person that you deserve to be responsible on some way for the activities of other white people. This gets into some really interesting questions there about whether we're going to get into telling teachers what they can teach, because that might make somebody feel guilty. And that's going to be the one that I think is going to bite us in the you-know-what later.
And Dylan, we got about 20 seconds left. What's something you're noticing that maybe didn't get a lot of attention that's going to maybe have some broader impacts?
Well, I think it's getting attention, but I don't think it's getting enough attention. Is also buried in those budget bills is the governor gave money for DPS officers to wear body cameras, but also allows them to redact as much footage of it as possible and makes it more difficult for the public and reporters like us to be able to obtain those records, which kind of defeats the whole purpose of why people were asking for these body cameras to exist in the first place.
All right. That's all the time we have tonight. I want to thank you both for joining us here.